Good. Oh, for God's sake, what's happening now? There we go. Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 8, which is going to be looking at the early era of post-Roman Britain. But to give people a chance to join the stream and what have you, I'm going to play us a tune.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wall. Your new gods sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made vain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love that heed and folly? Bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall wail gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come thou to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age would give what wisdom the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden,
And that was, of course, the excellent Chris Gard. Do go and check out his YouTube channel if you like good music. Welcome to my guests this evening, Mitch and AI. And I'm happy to say that both these chaps know a lot more about this subject than I do. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to, I think, Mitch to start with. And take it away, boys.
Yeah, so this is all about the Anglo-Saxon settlement or invasion, depending on your perspective, and also depending on what uh, let's say what people believe truly happened at this time, because there's a lot of debate, of course, because the problem is there's not a great deal of written record about the fifth and early and let's say sixth centuries regarding the Anglo-Saxon invasion, other than third-party accounts by, let's say, Gallo-Roman aristocrats or Greek historians, and so on. So yeah, this is one where, on the genetic side, Survivor Jive is a good source because he'll often refer to particular studies that show, okay, certain areas, let's say Cambridgeshire or East Anglia, massive Anglo-Saxon ancestry to be found there, and because of a, because of a range of factors, such as, for example, I believe it was something like 80% population replacement happened in East Anglia. So the Anglo-Saxon settlement took a massive turn there, whereas, let's say, over the southwest, like Cornwall way, different ball game where people were more
Yeah,
assimilated.
I think
Can
I think in
I,
the
guys, can I just say, Duke Valentino's asked a question. What do you think of the Fall of Civilization podcast on this topic? I thought it was pretty good, but I will let Mitch and AI reply to
oh,
that first.
I haven't I've seen their stuff on the Roman um empires and stuff. I haven't actually seen that particular episode though, so I need to
I think that was their first episode, AI, but I thought it was pretty good. Have you seen it, Mitch?
I've seen fragments of it, and it's like the same with History Time. I believe another channel that does about this period. Very good at setting the scene. Like I'm watching Fall Civilization about another topic completely different from this, and I quite like it. So I'd recommend it if people wanted to learn more about this period. But
mm,
also, the other thing I'd recommend is there's a poem called The Ruin. Now, we don't fully know all the words of that poem because uh, the manuscript got a bit damaged, I believe. But it's a good poem if you want to look at how the Anglo-Saxons looked at the ruins of ancient Rome. Because, for example, Anglo-Saxon London was not a continuation of Roman Londinium. They're two very separate entities. So and this is a common thing where the Anglo-Saxons, if they settle a city like London or York, they don't repurpose the ruins; they just leave them there because,
mm.
of course, because I think Mark Morris said it best. The likeliest answer as to why Old English dominated, and we don't speak a dialect of Latin like the French or the Italians or the Spanish do, is because by the time the Saxons really come over in force, massive civilizational collapse happens over here.
Yeah,
Where
and you don't see that in Gaul. I mean, with Gaul, the Salian Franks that would go to dominate and create the Frankish realm. Quickly, Clovis he quickly converted to Christianity. His and his court interchanged with the Gallic Roman population, um, and the institutions on the ground, the church and the even elements of the patrician class continued. You saw the same in Visigothic Spain as well, to a certain degree, though. In that context, the Goths there um, spent quite a while keeping the lot of the Romano sort of Iberian population out of major positions within administration and government. Ostrogoths, they actually the Senate, the Roman Senate, still continued under the Ostrogoths, and they were quite instrumental in getting the Romans under under Justinian and Belisarius to invade and sort of liberate them. But as Mitch says, with Britain, what was the unique case is it's almost like it was the apocalyptic version of I mean, even the Vandals in North Africa, who were very hostile to the Nicene creed of Christians and the Roman populations at large, still, had to operate within the framework that they were a minority in North Africa compared to the Romanized, Latinized populations there. But Great Britain, it was quite different. And I mean, I haven't. There's a few theories that I think what is interesting though is that, as Mitch mentioned, in East Anglia, for example, there is what you see is just straight up population replacement on the 75%, I think, or 80% level. I think it's same is I remember Survive the Jive in a stream where he did the breakdown of genetic studies through burial practices, shows across the eastern England, from all the way up from Northumbria down, you see an entire population replacement, where basically the Celtic Romano-British people were just not present in any significant. There wasn't any like assimilation or anything. It's just they were not present. And there's maybe me and Mitch can go into how that occurred. You have the the war, probably natural exodus, but also there's one third thing that I've always believed, and I'd be interested to know. I think Mark Morris even sort of touched upon it, but there's no evidence to prove this. But at this time, you did have one of the largest European plagues rampaging through the Roman world and in the Mediterranean, which was the Justinian plague, which I think played quite a significant factor.
It might have,
Um,
yeah, it might have. Just
yeah.
just for the audience here, guys, the Romans had pretty much totally left Britain by about 410. I think that would be fair to say. And in fact, most of them had left before that. But the Romano-British higher echelons, shall we say, who had most adopted sort of Roman culture, those guys carried on for a fair while, actually. But what happened was that the administration in Britain broke down to the city and town level. So there was no kind of overarching national stuff. And I think I'm correct in saying that the Saxons were, in fact, first invited in by the Romano-British as guards and bodyguards and this kind of stuff. Would that be correct to say, guys?
Yeah, the thing was, so in 383, there was a guy called Magnus Maximus. He took all the legions in Britain and used it to contest for the imperial throne. He lost, and all the legions of Britain got annihilated. After that, basically, a lot of the garrison duties had to fall upon Germanic mercenaries.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
the reason,
that's what I thought. That's what I thought. Could I just say to Duke Valentino in the chat, a lot of Romano-British, and there were never that many actual Romans in Britain. Most of
no.
as someone pointed out earlier, the people guarding Hadrian's Wall, etc., were auxiliaries. They were. The Roman army was divided into the legions, which were kind of like, the regular troops. And then they had auxiliaries who were mostly equipped and trained very like the Romans, but they were people who were raised from various parts of the empire.
Yeah.
So it was perfectly possible for British people, for example, to serve in Roman auxiliary units. And some of them did.
I was going to say the reason why they were invited in as well. One of the big reasons was that the Picts north of Hadrian's Wall began raiding and encroaching. You also had, and this is something that isn't really talked about much, but you did have Irish and even small-scale Irish settlements in modern-day Wales, Western Wales, and encroachment there. of course, you had the slave trade from Ireland, very famous because, of course, that's
Well,
where St. Patrick.
that's how Dublin started. Dublin was originally a Viking slave trading port,
Yeah,
basically.
and it's the origin story of St. Patrick, who whose family his father, from what we understand from his biography, his father was around in this time period, was um a figure within the church, but also a Roman administrator. I forgot the act. I think it was like like some sort of prefect or
Yeah.
prefector or whatever
It's
the title was.
also, I think it's also true that the reason part of France is called Brittany is because quite a lot of the Romano-British actually fled there when the Romans abandoned Britain, because of course France, or Gaul as it then was still Roman even after Britain was abandoned. And so Brittany was actually full of Romano-British, which is how it got its name.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, the reason why a lot of Saxons, Angles, and Jutes would have gone into service in Britain was, I mean, of course, they have the long history of raiding along the Saxon shore, so that's East Anglia, and eastern part of England today, but also at this time or within this time frame, you had the rise of the Huns, the Hunnic Empire, which pushed a lot of the Germanic tribes, like the Franks, like the Burgundians, the Goths, and so on, westward, which sort of forced a lot of pressure. It caused that pressure on Rome, but also it opened up the opportunities for those Germanic tribes to actually come in and act as auxiliaries, especially given the level of defeat that occurred, and um, you know that the Western Empire experienced. I mean, the Eastern Empire did experience. I think it was at the Battle of Adrianople, which was a really huge defeat. That never they were able to recover in some capacity, but yeah.
All right, guys. I'm sorry, Mitch. I interrupted you while you were doing your story here, so please carry on.
Another thing was with so one thing that's reckoned with the collapse of Roman Britain. The thing was the population for so long had lived with the comforts of Roman Britain that it would take a long time for them to relearn the old habits of fighting. So it was reckoned that around 3 ships. So you think a lot of 3 Saxon ships. That's like I'm trying to think like a few dozen warriors perhaps would be paid by the Romano Britain to supplement their forces in terms of battling against the Pictish in the north. Now, it's generally said that I believe it's the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or some other source, I can't remember. They said, "Oh, the Saxons were very good at fighting the Pictish, but of course, uh, Vortigern lusted after the daughter of Hengist, I believe. So Hengist and Horsa,
That
they were able to use this, and they were able to just rack it up how much land they received."
Yes, I believe that was from Bede.
Yeah, I remember reading it somewhere else. Like someone else mentioned, I think probably Mark Morris or someone else mentioned, or the other book I got is James Campbell's Anglo-Saxons book, which is a lot more archaeological. But yeah, so you have you have Hengist and Horsa. Of course, this is one thing that Survivor George mentions, where Hengist and Horsa, both their names literally translate as stallion in Old English, and that goes in with this wider Indo-European tradition of divine twins, because of course Hengist and Horsa said they were descended from Woden, like great grandsons of
Yeah,
Woden, and
like Romulus and Remus in
yeah,
Rome. Yeah.
yeah, this is like so. Some people might go, Hengist and Horsa used to, yeah, it's a crime event, not better known in the sense because everyone knows of Romulus and Remus in reference to ancient Rome, whereas Hengist and Horsa, the legendary co-founders of England in an ethnic capacity, are better known. But yeah, so firstly, they were paid like they demanded the island of Thanet, which I believe is off the coast of Essex, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And then later they demand the entirety of Kent, which is why the county of Kent historically has the white horse as their banner, in the same way that neither Saxon in northern Germany or Lower Saxony had the same white horse as their regional flag. As for some people in chat are going about the Anglo-Saxons being completely ignorant, it's more a matter of there just wasn't anything worth preserving by the time the Saxons come over here in force. Because, for example, around 450, we can find artifacts of Romano-British jewellery being used in Saxon settlements around the River Thames. But by 500 AD, that element of fashion completely disappears, and everyone just chooses to fall in with the fashions of Germanic animal jewellery and so on, like what is found in Scandinavia and so on. So it's quite a nuanced picture where some areas have a lot more contact with the Romano-British and have their jewellery emulate that, whereas other areas, especially up in, let's say, especially let's say Norfolk way, completely different, where they just have no contact and all their burial practices, all their jewellery, all their clothing is same standard as what they'd be like if they were back in northern Germany.
And it's also, the Anglo-Saxons, they weren't, they didn't like swell the cities. They didn't. It's not like that they were, the city dwelling. Their particular function was farming, was working the land, cultivating the land, which is something that didn't really occur fully under the Romans. There wasn't any significant development because, like most of the Roman Empire, a lot of the provinces were subsidized by other provinces, which then created like problems down the line. I mean, even Rome itself, Italy itself, suffered problems in that regard. But I mean, I like in referring to Mark Morris's book when the Saint Augustine and his mission to into Anglo-Saxon England. This isn't the same Augustine of Hippo. This is the Augustine of Canterbury, by the way. So different Saint Augustine. They noted that London was basically deserted. I think it'd been actually because it wasn't maintained. There was even parts of it were flooded, and it's not because I actually don't believe it was like they were ignorant. They knew what the Romans were. That whole quote about these stones being giants, I think, comes from a 19th century quote. It's nothing to do with anything contemporary. It's just that Roman towns and cities were left to ruin because they didn't serve any immediate function to Anglo-Saxon clans or their society or the king or the kingdoms that would come out of them. I mean, like take Lichfield, for example. I mean, you did have Anglo-Saxon towns that did spring up, within old Roman settlements of some degree, to places like Lichfield and Exeter. Exeter was a quite important one for Wessex, and I was just trying to think of where else. York, Bamborough. So you did have, they did have developed, sort of settlements, but at the time, the highest commodity was actually land for farming, because that's what could produce anything of value, right? I mean that was the currency of the day, the main currency of the day.
Yeah, it's also worth noting when, like, with Roman Britain, working mint in Britain since 326 AD. So when the Roman Empire in that area collapses, there's no coins minted, and everyone has to go back to bartering as a method of commerce. And of course, another thing was Celtic hill forts started to be used again. So you think of, for example, you think, for example, of that scene from Fellowship of the Ring where they're stopping at Ammon's Soul. You can imagine that being replicated for like masses of Celtic civilians fleeing from the Anglo-Saxons, where we go back to the Celtic hill forts that their pagan ancestors used to use. So it's fair to say that amidst like the Anglo-Saxons coming in, the existing population basically they regressed so far. It was basically the Bronze Age all over again.
Yeah, I mean the funny thing is, like in parts, I mean Cornwall, for example, you had like a Cornish king who, unlike his neighboring Celtic neighbors, where you still had like the Christianity was Roman. We know from archaeological, for example, that in places of the West Country like Somerset, Dorset, before the arrival of the Saxons, there was still Christianity was embedded in the people. But then we also know in Cornwall, for example, that the king there, according to legend, but also through similar archaeological, that they threw off Christianity. That Christianity had to be reintroduced via the Irish and Welsh monks, Saint Perrin, for example, and same in parts of Wales as well. Yeah, so there was some like hinterlands of the, I guess you could say, and people, I think, but someone in chat who was talking about this, there were parts of Roman Britain which weren't Romanized. So when the Romans left, they just immediately reverted back. But of course, the Celts living in, say, the proximity of London or in, you know, uh, the south or the southeast probably didn't. The culture itself was already fused in some way.
Yeah, so Southeast England was the most Romanized part of Britain, because that's the part of Britain they'd been in longest, and it was also during the Roman era. Once you got over rebellions like Boudicca, etc., then it was also very peaceful in the southeast of England. One thing the Romans did do for Britain was, in large parts of it, the place became very peaceful, because prior to the Romans arriving, the various British tribes were fighting each other all the time. So,
Yeah,
I think it's also worth reminding people in the chat that what we're talking about today is the very early period of Saxon settlement and invasion, if you want to call it that. So we're talking about the 400s and 500s. We're not talking about the 800s. So when Alfred the Great and what have you was around, and then by which time the Saxon kingdoms had become quite civilized. And people like Alfred the Great himself, he went to Rome, I think twice actually. He certainly went once. And as people have said in the chat, people like Alfred could certainly read Latin and knew exactly who had created all these old buildings and what have you. But that was a much later period. What we're talking about today, for the most part, is the early Saxon settlement, when the levels of civilization, as AI has been saying, were not all that high, and you're mostly talking about little villages and what have you. Anyway, that was my little contribution to this, but you guys carry on.
I actually I do want to, just in case there are people watching who may be confused on this. So this is a bit of a context here. So Northern England, so what would become Northumbria, parts of Mercia and East Anglia, would be settled by Angles. So they'd go up the Humber, they would go into the East Anglia and to the fens round there. The Saxons would settle in just around, go up the Thames estuary, and they would settle in Sussex, East Sax, so that's around Suffolk, parts of Suffolk region, and then they would also go on to into parts of Dorset. The Saxons, you would have Saxon tribes that would go into Dorset that would make up, and Wiltshire, which would make up the West Saxons. And
there were also Jutes, weren't they?
Yeah, hold, yeah. Sorry, I was going to say, and the Jutes finally would where Henderson would sort of arrive in Kent, and also parts around the Isle of Wight in particular. You had the Dukes that arrived in the Isle of Wight, and these weren't like they didn't come like ready-made like kingdoms or anything, and I think some people like to think, oh, immediately formed like the West Saxon kingdom. These would have been probably many hundreds of different clans, tribes, sub tribes, but the trouble is we just don't know their names. We have, I mean, take the the House of West Saxon, the of Wessex. That was most likely a house with the wyvern in my which is my profile pic here. This would have been the house that would have um uh one, would have been the leading sort of power in that part of the West Country that would then go on to be the dominant kingdom. And same in Mercia and in Northumbria. With Northumbria was actually a bit of a late start, because you had the Angles who settled in Deria and in Bernica. So that would be, so Bernica would be Northumbria. Deria is basically Yorkshire, South Yorkshire region. And then you had Lindsay, which is I believe it's Lincolnshire. And then of course Mercia as well. And that's not to mention as well. I think you had like the Middle Anglians or Anglicans, or I'm not too familiar with them, but you had like various dispersed bit, and it's funny because you look at their settlements as well. It all goes along the river networks around England.
Yeah,
Yeah,
these were seafaring people. Is that not right, Mitch?
yeah, the Saxons especially. But Angles. So Angles are named after the fishing technique of angling because they came from Schleswig-Holstein in northern, and they had to live in swamps, so they had to be by nature maritime. The Jutes also they came from Denmark, as said, like Jutland, mainly Denmark. So yeah, there's that. The other thing I was going to say was so I know of two Anglo-Saxon tribes in like my case of Staffordshire, where so for example you have one tribe named named as a Tamset, named Tamset or Tame dwellers, of course, who created the city of, who created the town of Tamworth, which later became the capital of Mercia. And then there was the Penksetter, because there's another river by the name of River Penk, and there's a little village called Penkridge, which still carries the name of that to the Anglo-Saxon tribe. So you often have like small tribes named
Yeah,
after a particular river next to.
Portsmouth. I believe Portsmouth is meant to be named after possibly an Anglo-Saxon warrior, chieftain, or a house or something. That's which his settlement would have been, Portsmouth region. And also like Mercia, for example. Now we think of people like Penda, the House of Mercia. Now the first one he's called Isel or Isel, um,
Oh,
and
just Ichel, I think, because
oh, Ichel,
some.
sorry,
Yeah, just a disclaimer. With the letter C, if it's around the letter I or E in Old English, it pronounces as a ch sound.
oh,
So,
Ichel. Okay. Okay, Icho, who the house would then be sort of known as the Ichlangus, the which would be the governing sort of house clan of Mercia, who would then go on and form the kingdom, um, and they were a house of Angles, for example. So yeah, at this stage that we're talking, um, these would be the people that would you would start to see quite quickly, these sorts of tribes, these particular clans, uh being the dominant among the Anglo-Saxon hierarchy, and would be the ones uniting the smaller clans. And I mean, like for example, there like the places like Lindsay, and for example, would just be absorbed totally absorbed by Northumbria or Mercia.
Yeah, it was, another thing, like, I mean, this is quite an interesting topic in itself. So the House of Wessex, they're also known as Cerdic, after because there
Yeah,
was a Anglo-Saxon war in that area called Cerdic. Now, Cerdic, as a name, comes from the Celtic Caradog. So this is one thing that happened also in this time where Anglo-Saxons come in and some Celtic names get converted to Anglo-Saxon ones. For example, Penda is an Anglo is Penda originally was a Celtic name, Cerdic, and later on you get certain names like Cadwallader and Cheldon. So among the West Saxon and Mercian dynasties, you do see there's a lot of there's quite a few Celtic names that come in and they're just anglicised.
which makes sense because the Saxons of the south, particularly in Wessex, were the one group of Germanic peoples who did, on genetic study and burial archaeological evidence, integrate, like actually did like intermarry with the Celtic population, um, more so than the Angles in Northumbria or parts of like Lindsey or East Anglia where you saw the population replacement, so that wasn't really necessary. But you did see it with like the Anglo-Saxon, and that's why there have been there's a reason why the wyvern here is there's some similarities with Welsh iconography, right? um Certain sort of connections there. And I know there's been some suggestion that actually the House of Wessex may have had like some sort of Celtic origin as well. I mean, I've honestly, I don't think there was. I think it's more. I mean, there may possibly a Germanic. He may have married a Celtic woman or something. And we know that there was a close, because going back to Alfred, for example, his closest confidant was Bishop Asser, who was a Celt from Wales. So yeah, we they did have that connection, for example.
Yeah, and that's another thing. So you have, uh, yeah, I don't know where to go with cherry football, but it does come into because on one hand, yeah, Mark Morris will say, okay, when the Anglo-Saxons come in, they don't bother trying to preserve anything of what was there before them. But at the same time, you do see a significant intermixing of culture. Like, for example, you notice some graves where the jewelry is inspired more by Romano or Romano Celtic designs, as well as, for example, you have a lot of Celtic names that are used by the invading English. So, for example, I say Cerdic and Cadwallader and Pendle and so on. But at the same time, it's like the language dominates to a point where in Old English, there are only 30 words they reckon come from Old Brythonic. Such was the massive domination that English, for example, as a language had back then, where there's just but so this is why, for example, in the Victorian period, they read off Gildas and go, okay, there must have been a massive population replacement, and there must have just been a complete wiping out of the pre-existing Celtic population. Whereas nowadays, because of genetic studies and so on, we know it's a lot more nuanced than simply, oh, they wiped them out, because it varies area to area.
Yeah, I mean, just to answer as well, Duke Valentino in chat there. When Wessex expanded, because again, the House of Wessex or the Saxons of Wessex was originally, Dorset, Wiltshire, and they would then go on. They would be like, the famous Battle of Bath, where they captured Bath from the Celts, Gloucestershire region. But by this time, they were already converted to Christianity. So when they arrived, say in Somerset, for example, the population of Somerset was already Christian, and so there wasn't like a great change. But then we know within you know a couple of hundred years they had already adopted um, Anglo-Saxon or Saxon names. which then this just goes to show that because there does appear to be that there was like constant settlement of where you had Anglo-Saxons who would arrive and settle in those areas, even though it was partly farming. I mean, there were areas, places like the Fens and the marshes of Somerset, where there was nothing there to anything of a significance apart from like a few religious sites, say.
Yeah, because there's often like because some people, so modern, a lot of modern historians, for example, they'll go, "Oh, the Anglo-Saxons, which is a small warrior elite," and they often and they portray, "Oh, it's only a bunch of men conquering and taking wives and so on." Which, if that were the case, then English wouldn't be the mainstay language, because let's say, for example, the Visigoths. Okay,
Yeah.
well, yeah, you often see where the men are a lot closer to Swedish genetically, whereas the women are genetically more Iberian in DNA. And over time, there's something when you say mother tongue when you say about what language a child learns, because the fathers, for example, they're going to be away at war for arguments, especially let's say the nobility. And this is why, for example, the Frankish, they go from speaking basically a language that, if it survived today, would sound very similar to Dutch. Instead, the Frankish over time become a lot more. They basically start speaking what we call today French, which is a Latin language, because they'd marry the local women, and over time, the women would teach the children the Gallo-Roman dialect, which later becomes French, because the men, especially the noble ones, would be away at war, because that's often why you often refer to that's why, for example, often you refer to someone's first language as their mother language, because you learn your language from your mum and so on. So
Yeah,
this is why.
you even when the Normans invaded, Richard the Lionheart could speak English, and the reason he could speak English was because his early years were spent in England, and his nurses were English, and
Yeah,
that's how he. So as Mitch is saying, mother tongue is the correct way to put it, because it's generally from women that you learn your first language when you're small.
Absolutely, and that's why it's such absolute nonsense that you hear from modern historians, particularly with the Norman invasion. I mean, the Norman invasion had little to no direct impact to like the demographics of the country. I mean, yes,
Yeah,
you just had the replacement of a ruling elite. That's the only change that really happened. There wasn't any significant changes to demographics of England at all. I mean, in many ways, for the House of Normandy towards when it up to King Stephen, they actually had it was a balancing act for them to sort of give lip service to the Anglo-Saxon the people that they were ruling over, but also maintaining its Franco-Norman holdings. But yeah, I mean, as Mitch said, yeah, I mean, there was it wasn't like the Visigoths, it wasn't like the Ostrogoths or the Franks. The Anglo-Saxons, wherever they went in Roman Britain, they dominated. They just totally dominated over the existing Celts to the point where it was that I mean, if they didn't, for example, you wouldn't have a concept of a Wales or West Wales. You wouldn't have because the term Wales is basically, as we spoke before, means foreigner. They understood each group, the Celts and the Anglo-Saxons knew who they were, what they were, and knew that each other were totally different, and they viewed each other as totally different. And that's
yeah,
why you had, like, for example, you would have Welsh raids into Mercia, and that's why Offa would build his famous dike as like a boundary as like a marcher's sort of boundary between his realm and the Welsh, and that is why you'd have Cornwall became a very distinct independent kingdom.
because the
With,
Romano-British held out there like they did in Wales, because it was the extreme west of the country.
exactly, and then when you had the arrival of Celtic Christianity, there was a reason why Wales and Cornwall were very quick, and parts of Cumbria, to accept Christianity as well, because in the early stages, in that period where the Celts were reaffirming themselves under sort of a Celtic Christian sort of moral unity, the Anglo-Saxons were still pagan, and that would become a problem because they would use Celtic Christianity to try and convert the Anglo-Saxons. And this is something that again, it's not talked about. Is you'll see Celtic Christian iconography in like, say, Bibles, in art, cartography, whatever you want to call it. A lot of it was inspired by Anglo-Saxon art styles, Anglo-Saxon jewelry designs, right? It was a way of making themselves sort of trying to embed themselves. And the trouble is, it didn't really work because they were Celts. That was the fundamental thing, is they were Celts. And when they converted, say, like the House of Northumbria or Mercia, or even the East Saxons, they would just revert back. There were several occasions, I think, in Northumbria, the king there would convert and then revert back to paganism and convert, and then convert again, or the next one would convert. And so it meant, I think the only real, like, Christianization success really probably was Kent. But it didn't really suffer any problems.
This is the early stages that AI is talking about here, of course, like, a long time before people like Alfred the Great. So people in the chat, you got to remember, this is the early settlement of Britain by the Saxons that we're talking about this evening.
Just to answer Duke Vantu, would someone from Northumbria understand someone from Wessex? Yes, they would understand, because Northumbrians were able to understand the Viking, the Norse Vikings, who arrived much later on after the sacking of Lindisfarne. They did understand them. Yeah, I believe even Alfred was able to speak to Guthrum very clearly, because a lot of them came. Guthrum was from Denmark, and Alfred was a Saxon, so they were from the same region. Yeah, they could understand each other.
Yeah, and it's like, for example, Duke Anderson was saying a bit earlier about why Old Norse never replaced English. Well, the thing was, the Danelaw was literally a matter of, well, the men coming in and mixing with local women. So you have loads of Scandinavian words filter in because the children of said mixed marriages, yeah, they are going to speak English because they learn it a lot from mum. However, they're also going to pick up certain Scandinavian words from the father. So this is why, for example, we have words like egg or husband in modern English today, because, and this is why, so the Anglo-Saxon settlement, we know there was massive shifts where they brought over both women and children with them, because if it was just English, if it was just Anglo-Saxon men, then English would never have dominated as a language, because, and if you have a mixed, let's say you have a mixed marriage between Anglo-Saxons and Welsh, and it's let's say, and the mass of the country is largely dominated by Celts. Like, normally what happens is the mixed children will tend to go more towards the Celtic side because they're going to learn the Celtic language from the mum. Whereas what happened actually was, okay, the Anglo-Saxons, it wasn't just the warriors taking over land, it was also, they brought over their women folk. And this is why, as I said, like, you have almost complete demographic replacement of areas like East Anglia and Lincolnshire by invading Anglo-Saxons, because they also brought over women and children, because the thing about East Anglia back in those days was it was a massive swamp in those days. Like, you still had the fens being a massive swamp, ideal for guerrilla warfare. And given that the Angles, for example, they came from a very similar country made up of swamps that flooded a lot. You can imagine they didn't want to deal with guerrilla warfare, so they just were very violent towards the pre-existing population to avoid any chance of said guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, I mean, imagine that you are Roman Celt living in, say East Anglia, and you have like these waves of, entire clans, men, women, and children, mainly men, but men, women, and children from, who were Anglians, arriving. And the fact is, you did have a slave class in Anglo-Saxon society where you did have Celts who were, in some, places like in Wessex, where among the Saxons, you did have like a slave class. You know, you would just leave. A lot of them. I mean, the reason why I know there's been like there's this belief that they just killed off the entire Roman Celtic populations, and then the survivors just stayed in Cornwall and Wales. I mean, of course, there is no archaeological evidence to say that it was like this all-out slaughter. But as I say, I believe it was a mixture of famine. Big part 'cause it was famine, because you had a natural disaster, which was the volcano eruption in Iceland, which caused like the darkening period at this time. You also had the Justinian plague, which would have you gone through urban centres, particularly London and Roman, London, where you still had trade. Because again, we know at this time that around this time, Roman Britain in the 6th century, or the Roman Celts were still trading with Justinian and his empire, because we have like I think it was like fabrics and everything found, and also tin, very big from Cornwall, tin still being sent to the Eastern Roman Empire. So we know there's that continuous trade. But I think it's a mixture of famine, the Justinian plague, and also just natural in-group exodus. Because at the end of the day, um, the people, a lot, I believe, a lot, particularly on the eastern side, they just would move westwards to escape the arrival of these Germanic peoples.
Yeah, but I remember just saying other puppet. Yeah, that's probably what I know. The Angles, it's reckoned that their homeland in Schleswig-Holstein was getting flooded a lot by the North Sea. So they reckon that the entire Angle tribe up sticks and moved over to England because
Yeah,
they're so. And you got factors. So, for example, whenever you had like a massive Germanic tribal migration against ancient Rome, like the Cimbrians, for example, that was usually like 200,000 on average. They reckon it was something like 500,000 Anglo-Saxons migrated over the space of the couple of centuries into Britain. And you got factor also, for example, yeah, the Anglo-Saxons and Jews were the tribes, but you did have individuals. Let's say someone from Norway could join in on this Anglo-Saxon migration, because after all the Germanic languages like Old English, Frankish, Dane, what would be like, I suppose, Old Norse back then as well, all mutually intelligible. So there would be nothing stopping, let's say, a guy of a Frankish tribe joining the Anglo-Saxons. Uh, yeah, the other, yeah, it's like the other thing was, of course, Attila the Hun was also rampaging through Europe, and a lot of the Anglo-Saxons were probably thinking, yeah, we want to get the hell out of Dodge by going on to Britain, which also happens, of course, being Ireland, and
yeah,
and of course, also you can imagine the Anglo-Saxons will look upon Britain in the same way that people used to look at America a couple of hundred years ago, the land of opportunity, loads of arable farmland just sparsely settled, in the same way that the Vikings were massively attracted to the Danelaw because areas like Lincolnshire were sparsely populated, and so they had a lot of farmland just up for grabs. So, yeah, it's reckoned that you had, like, let's say, for argument's 500,000, which I mean, reckon that, so before the Roman Empire collapsed in Britain, they reckon about 2 million people lived in Roman Britain. I, I mean, they reckon that half of that population perished as a result of like famines, Justinian plague, and whatnot, as well as emigration. You enter in then 500,000 Anglo-Saxon settlers. You can very very easily then understand why Old English dominated over the native Brythonic languages and wiped out any British Latin dialects from ever forming up. like it did in, let's say, like it did in, say, Gaul or Iberia.
Yeah, and it's funny because even in now, this is something I noticed a few years ago. I went to Norfolk. I went stopped on all the way to Essex, but went to Norfolk. And where I live, because I live in you know, West Wales. I've lived in the West Wales area for a while. And one thing I've noticed, particularly when I went to the eastern part of England, even today, there are a lot more, blondes, for example. I've noticed there are a lot more blondes than, say, and I remember, like in Wales, like for example, my grandfather was I guess you could say, like a dark Briton, from Cornwall, but there is that distinct difference from someone, say, from Eastern England, um, and probably also parts of Northern England as well, uh, and it's still noticeable today. It's still noticeable today.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Just to let people know, this is part one of a two-part stream. Next week, and it will be on Wednesday next week, we're going to look at the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms once they had become, they formed up more, and there were three main kingdoms by this stage. And we're going to be looking at that next week, and I hope Mitch and AI will be joining me for that one as well. So this is part one of a two-part stream. But also, I'd just like to remind people, if you want to ask a super chat question or support the channel, you can do that via Entropy. There is a link pinned at the top of the chat. And also, please like the stream, people, because it does actually help the channel when we get likes. So if you do that, I'd be most grateful. Mitch, would you like to carry on?
I'm just, yeah. So you have journey at this point where Anglo-Saxons are coming in massively, and of course you can imagine it's kind of like the Reconquista. When you look at like maps of the Reconquista in Iberia, where you get certain chunks of land taken between a period, and then the next period comes along, and this other chunk of land gets taken over. So that's what, yeah, that's like what happened, where you have the initial phase was largely the Anglo-Saxons taking over land and then bringing over the women and children. Then, so for example, East Anglia, Essex, Kent would be very Anglo-Saxon, and then let's say we take over chunks after that with it, and it'd be a mixture of them populating land with their own children, plus also assimilating any locals who stay behind. Because Survivor Drive, I remember him mentioning a while back, there was a grave of a guy buried with Anglo-Saxon grave goods. So this guy was a pagan, Anglo-Saxon pagan. He was, so genetically he's 100% Celtic, but he was assimilated into the Anglo-Saxon tradition. So when it's often like, so let's say for argument's sake, you can see someone go, oh well, we can find like this Anglo-Saxon grave. Sometimes, yeah, you can have situations where actually the person got 100% Celtic, but they just got assimilated by the Anglo-Saxons, and yeah, you can imagine over time you'd have. I don't know where I'm going with. Yeah, you just have areas where the locals would mix with the Germanic tribes over time. So, for example, let's say in my neck of the woods, West Midlands. Now, I imagine we're a lot more Celtic genetically than Anglo-Saxon, but there's significant Anglo-Saxon blood within us. So there's a lot more intermixing, whereas, as is mentioned, East Anglia, white, completely different story. Another thing is, I don't know if Survivor Joe said this sort of, like, because it's reckoned that with Kent, so for example, when they have a lot of trade with the Merovingian Empire, and as a result, they reckon that some migration happened between Merovingian France. Let's say, for argument's sake, there's overpopulation on the continent, so some Frankish people would come over. So that's all. So this also presents itself where you might get areas where someone is both genetically Anglo-Saxon but also more French, but technically not French in the way you would think of it today. It's more like they were Frankish people, and of course back then the Frankish they spoke a language which basically would sound
Mm.
like Dutch to our ears.
The trouble is because you had the Salian Franks, which is where the Merovingian come from, and then you had the Ripuarian Franks, which are the more Frisian Dutch, um, Upper Rhine, Franks. I would have imagined, I would have imagined maybe the Ripuarian Franks may have, who if they're part of the Frisian sort of collective. I mean, there is like archaeological evidence to say that there are like Frisians like buried in parts of like say York and up and down. And this is another theory that's put out that during these Germanic waves coming in, that you had, say, for example, some Anglo-Saxon, sorry, some Celtic, you know, small little, independent kingdoms or what have you, may have even hired other Germanics to take on the Anglo-Saxons. So you had like this continuous sort of looking for support and then everything else. But yeah, um, there's quite a few Frisians that I think probably did arrive as well on the back of a lot of this.
Yeah, so even today, like Frisian is quite mutually intelligible in a lot of sentences with modern English. So you can imagine there'd be no barriers for Frisians to join in with the Anglo-Saxon invaders and settlers, and of course, so uh, yeah, and also you factor like the journey from Frisia to England would be a lot less to deal with. So because it's often said that with the Anglo-Saxon invasion, there's logistical issues with saying there was massive population shift. But I mean, let's say for argument's sake, average Anglo-Saxon ship, it was often said that you could have about 10 captives at least, because one Anglo-Saxon custom was if you had 10 prisoners or more on a ship, you had to
Yeah.
sacrifice the 10th to Funor to bless you on your way home on the ship. So you can imagine, let's say, the average Anglo-Saxon ship, especially in this period, probably could carry something like, I don't know, let's say 30 to 50 people, depending on the kind of ship. So let's say, and such a ship were to make, let's say, 10 journeys per year, you could have like, I don't know, 10 such ships or 100 such ships making regular journeys year by year. You can imagine it just multiplies into quite a considerable population shift, especially in areas closest to the continent, like East Anglia and Kent and Essex and Kent and so on. So that's
Mm.
that's it. Because Mark Mammers, I believe, yeah, yeah. So it's not logistically impossible at all to do massive population shift in that way, especially when you factor, of course, you know, of course, you can sail along the coastlines of northern Germany and the Netherlands into Brittany. I mean, Britain, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I've had debates before. I mean, there's one person who couldn't get the idea that I said, oh, these people were the ones that arrived in these ships, and I think there was, in the initial stages of settlements, you did have, um, you know, it probably started off, as smaller parties, and then, as we know, along, up along the Humber River and everything, similar to what the Vikings would do a couple hundred years later. You did have, this sort of incursion, but a lot of them were, trained warriors, but at the same time their proper profession would have been craftsmen, farmers, mainly farmers, and they would have been, um following, their clan chieftain or their lord, or I mean, they wouldn't have called them lord, but they would followed their, um what would it be? Would they refer to him as jarl? Was that
Depends. So, let's say, for example, a duke would be referred to as an ealdorman, or a
okay?
count would be an earl.
So it would have been alderman or earl. So they would have been following their their clan, the clan hierarchy. And also this is the thing is, and this is something we will know talk about. There is in Britain more so than anywhere else in the other Roman provinces, so many hoards of buried gold from the Romano Celts, particularly people who would have been Romanized Celts, like really Romanized Celts, who probably had functions in government in Britain and who were very wealthy, particularly along. I mean, there are quite a few ones. There's one, the famous one in Suffolk that was discovered in '92, which is the opening bit of Mark Morris's book, where it is believed that the person who buried it, whose name has no significance in any historical record, but the gold coins that were buried obviously shows he would have been a very wealthy, or his family were very wealthy, and probably some sort of involved in the local governance there. And we know from the coins that it was from it would have had to have been after 410. So this is late, very late. This is late stage Roman Britain, but also where I am in the West Country, you had buried Roman gold, and from late emperors like Honorius and Valens and such. And they must. The reason they buried it is the idea is fear of it. It's fear, right, of it being captured in raids, and so that also gives the impression that they believed that they could come back and get it. So that in itself is quite interesting because obviously there was still this belief that actually the legions would return, and I think which makes sense because there have been in Roman history, for example, cases where legions would leave a province to go off and fight maybe some sort of a civil war with the Sassanids, and then they would eventually return and to their provinces, their natural provinces. But in this context, it does appear that the Romano population, the Celtic population, did view that there would be a return.
Yeah, I think that you're quite right, AI, about that. But just to address Duke Valentino in the chat, in terms of things like Norse raids and all that kind of stuff, we'll be talking about that next week when we talk about the settled Saxon kingdoms like Wessex, etc. So that stuff we'll talk about next week. For the most part, as I say, this episode is really about the early Saxon settlements.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key settlements that you've, as I said, is places like Lichfield was a key area for what would be the Mercians. York, Hull, particularly Hull, was a lot of key sites. I'm just trying to think. St Albans, what's now around St Albans as well, very important Anglo-Saxon settlement. And then of course like Clacton, Thanet, mentioned Portsmouth. The places like London, not particularly. But then what's funny is in turn Bath, which was a which is a Roman city, was actually populated. Was actually very key to. It was like in many ways the House of Wessex used it as like a winter residence. In some cases, it was like another capital for them, even though their capital was in Winchester, which again was an Anglo-Saxon. Again a major area for the Anglo-Saxons settlement-wise.
Yeah, I know. I think Hereford. I know there was like a Roman fort or somewhere nearby where the because of course Hereford literally translates as army fort because of course if as an Anglo-Saxon lord you were to wage war against the Welsh, Hereford would be where you put a rally point as an army to venture west. So it's one of those things where on one hand they don't the co-opt a lot of the structure that happened beforehand, but also don't at the same time. I think is that the same with London, right? I mean, Anglo-Saxons built up London, which the which part WRC largely means trading city. So, for example, the oldest contiguous longest living city. So the city that's been lived in the longest in our history is Ipswich, which was of course built up by
Yeah,
the Anglo-Saxons. And the which part literally means it's like yeah, is that the same with York? Used to be whatever, which just means trading port. So
yeah.
and
I mean,
yeah, with
y-
Ipswich, I think which other river ran right up to it to a point where ships could embark and disembark back in those days.
yeah. The before, as I say, before Northumbria, you had the sort of realms, the Angle realms of Bernicia and Deria in Northumbria and Yorkshire. Um, and up in Hexham, for example, the Anglo-Saxons there, they would take chunks from the wall, Hadrian's Wall, um, to build up. I mean, this is a bit later as well, but they would use parts of the wall to build up Hexham. And this practice would continue well beyond the Anglo-Saxon age into the Middle Ages. Churches, for example, estates, country estates would be used, um, would uh, would be used parts of Hadrian's Wall. I think even Carlisle, the city of Carlisle was also, parts of that was used from Hadrian's Wall, and that's why it's in such a condition as it is today. It's been slowly reused over time.
Duke of Ellington was actually when the separation kingdoms. I mean, the thing was a lot of the Anglo-Saxon conquest was just like you'd have, let's say, a family, let's say, for example, you had a warlord who would have quite a following behind him, and he'd take over a patch of land. Then you have a situation where they would consolidate under the rule of, like, say, one warlord who'd call himself a king. So, for example, Mercia, you'd have loads of like small tribes ranging from like, Shropshire all the way to Lincolnshire, and it was under it was under the Ichlanders dynasty that they all got consolidated into one big. It's not the same with Wessex and Kent and so on. Like, you'd have like small tribes coalescing around one family that would dominate over all others in a given area.
Yeah,
So
and they'd all have to give tribute in like in means of mainly like farming, agricultural goods, cattle, pigs, that sort of stuff. Beer, even beer, and particularly I know in Wessex, for example, beer was something they would have to give tribute into towards the king, fabrics, crafts, certain crafts, and everything. Because at this point, you just didn't have a currency. It didn't have a currency based system that you would have later on.
yeah, and also Duke is asking about resistance from the native Celts. Well, so Gildas often writes about it. So when people think of a phrase "Knight of the Long Knives," you normally think of mustached man with a certain homosexual, whereas the original Knight of the Long Knives was basically a bunch of was basically the Anglo-Saxons. I believe it was in Wessex or somewhere down south where they said up to the Celtic lords in the area, "Oh, let's come and talk about peace." But once the Celtic lords all arrived, the Anglo-Saxons had killed them all because
Yeah,
the massive
you had
decapitation.
yeah, it was the Roman patrician called Ambrosi or some Ambrose, who
Ambrose,
many yeah
Ambrosius
Ambrose.
Aurelianus.
That's right. Who led the resistance around the Cotswolds region, Bath region, sort of northeast Somerset region, and he is very much. If I was to guess, King Arthur. the legend of King Arthur contributed to a real person, I would say he is probably the inspiration, or a key inspiration behind that. If I was to guess, that's it. Sort of all fits out because he did seem to be a significant figure in the region. He was able to garner a lot of you know uh, sort of people in the Celts surrounding to unite. Of course, though, he failed, and the Anglo-Saxons the Wessex were able to beat him. They captured Bath, and then would go on to later sort of move onwards. I will say there was a Saxons between Wessex and Mercia called Hegwis, in Gloucestershire region, um, who were separate, but they would later be absorbed into the Wessex and Mercian fold. Because again, that's the trouble with these sort of state. If they're sandwiched between two powerful, you know, powerful houses, you end up, that is just what happens.
Yeah, and you also had so for example, certain battles are talked a bit more by the Celts. So, for example, there's a battle called Daleven, where after that battle, the Celts of Cornwall and Devon were separated from the Celts of Wales. Because up until
Yeah,
that point, there's a land corridor that connected the two. But after that battle, this is why, for example, Cornish and Welsh differentiate a lot because they no longer had that land corridor, and at that point, they lost. Uh, they lost that land connection, and I think it's like that's the main reason why. Also, uh, the main reason why. So Wales doesn't get taken over. Some people reckon it's because most of that because Wales was largely rugged countryside, and it just wasn't as high value land. Whereas the land, of course, modern England had all the good agricultural land. I mean, Anglo-Saxons had enough. Um, Yeah, so that was why Wales was never conquered by the Anglo-Saxons at that point, was because it was just ideal terrain for guerrilla warfare with the mountains and whatnot. I mean, you got Cornwall, which at that time was heavily wooded. So this is why Gildas often says, like, while uh, the Celts have been beaten in huge tracts of the country, like Kent and Wessex and Mercia and so on, areas like Cornwall, Devon, and Wales they were able to fend them off using the woods or the mountains.
yeah. Devon in particular. I mean, Devon has a great many of forests, and also you have the moors as well. You have Dartmoor, Exmoor, um, which as well acts like a sort of forward barrier because it's very, it's quite a inhospitable sort of terrain to cross. Um, and also I mean, farming wise, it's really not, as you said, it's not good land. It's just and when you did have Saxon expansion, Wessex expansion in say Devon, for example. It really was. I think it was in the time of Alfred, or it was after his. It was really after his. I mean, that time, places like Exeter were already. They were the frontier sort of area in Devon, but the rest of what we now today is modern Devon really didn't come about until, uh, you know, towards the late rule of Alfred after his defeat of Guthrum. I mean, in North Devon there's an old Anglo-Saxon chapel, but we know this to be very, very, um, you know, probably about 10th century. They reckon it's a 10th century one, um, which there's which is still sort of in its oldish style, even though you've had the Normans and the Reformations in between. Uh, but I think Devon wasn't really fully formalized into the Wessex realm until the ninth, 10th century.
Yeah, Devon. I think it was like I don't know if it was Alfred the Great or or it was Athelstan, his grandson, who took over that. I mean, Cornwall. Yeah, Cornwall did get taken over, but it wasn't until like the Tudor period that the Cornish language would really start to disappear. Because it was at 1750 when Cornish fully disappeared off the map. As for yeah, I was going to say, so someone was asking what relationship did the Anglo-Saxons have with the Welsh? It depends on who it was. For example, Penda of Mercia, he would often ally, as a pagan, he'd sometimes ally with certain Welsh Christian rulers against against Wessex or Northumbria because it could be a mere pragmatic interest. Because yeah, a lot of the time the Mercians, because one thing to bear in mind is Mercia translated to Old English as borderland. So it, so Mercia was always on a battlefield kind of situation because they were surrounded to the west by the Welsh, north by Northumbrians, and to the south by the likes of East Anglia, Wessex, and Kent, who would often chip away their borders. So Mercia would sometimes work with the Welsh, whether Mercia was a Christian at the time or not, against other Anglo-Saxon Christians. So, however, as Mark Most would say, Offa's Dyke was never built against Northumbria or East Anglia or Wessex because everyone understood they were all pretty much the same people, just like divided by ruling dynasties. So it's kind of like same with like Germany, for example. Yeah, you don't need a formalized German state to know that Swabians and Bavarians and Saxons are fundamentally the one, like fundamental of one ethnic stock, shall we say, like that can be united into one nation. So that's pretty much what happened with Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Yeah, they'd fight each other over because there's an Anglo-Saxon word called Bretwalda, which means he who controlled Britain. It's kind of like an old way of saying emperor back then. So
Yeah,
that
and
so quite
and yeah,
nuanced. Yeah.
someone like Alfred, for example. I mean, he coined the term, the king of the Anglo-Saxons, or the king of the English. So I mean, it wasn't about the land itself; it was about the people. He was the king of the English. So you could be an Anglo-Saxon person who's currently living in the Danelaw, for example, or in like an occupied bit of territory under the control of a Viking ruler, and he's still your king, because he's the king of the people, the English people. Same with the title like King of the Scots. It's not the King of Scotland; it's the King of the Scots. Same concept.
Yes, you have so in so Alfred Grade he uses the word Anglekin. Now Anglekin literally means it's like a very ethnic nationalist kind of term to refer to the English. So and another thing was back in those days, you call yourself king of a people, you didn't call yourself king of a land because back then Anglo Saxons used to believe it debased the concept of kingship because you know it's got. I mean, I suppose you can get a modern debate about it because you got, let's say you have King of England versus King of the English. So and yeah, and it's yeah, that was the main unit because kinship was a very big concept among Anglo Saxons. Like for example, you'd often have, let's say, Anglo Saxon swords, very luxury item to have. They'd often have like, runes put up on them, and they'd have like family mottos, or they'd have like certain. Uh, you'd have, for example, the name of a god because the House of Wessex claims descent from Walden. I believe the House of Kent they claim descent also from Walden. East Anglia, however, they claim descent from Funor, I believe it was. So, and that still carried on back even after they converted to Christianity. So it was very much a case of kinship was the main unifying principle of the English at that time. Didn't matter if you came from Northumbria or Mercia or Wessex. You all understood each other to be fundamentally the same people. It's just the main matter being, of course, the ruling dynasties will clash one against one another. Like you have, for example, King Radwald, who, of course, that certain new helmet was made for. Yeah, he would subject all the other kingdoms around him, like Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex, and he'd rule over all of modern day England. for a time, but it wouldn't surpass his death because this was a main problem with these times of Anglo-Saxon England, where they didn't have bureaucracies or state institutions to sustain a kingdom after the main warlord had died. So war was just a common feature amongst all Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. You might have, let's say, for example, and also a lot of fratricide, because King Offa of Mercia, for example, he often had to kill off a lot of his male relatives to avoid civil war and so on.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, Mitch. I was just going to say, because you mentioned Anglo-Saxon swords, which of course were very similar to Norse swords. The other thing that was also quite common was the sax, which is partly where you get the name Saxon from. And the sax was like a big knife or a small sword, however you want to consider these things. And it was somewhat like a modern Bowie knife in some respects, and was certainly used in war.
Yeah. Andrew, I'm going to have to head off in a minute.
Yeah.
Though before I go, I got a little video. I got it shared in the tab.
Oh, hang
below.
on, I'll put it onto the screen. Hang on, mate.
It's an old edit that I've. I think Mitch will enjoy this one.
Okay, you should be able to play it, I think.
Yeah. There we go.
Saxons, indeed. YouTube Sucks in the chat wants to know how they would prove kinship.
Well, it's in their writing. It's the fact that they differentiate themselves, but the fact that they even use a term like Welsh to refer to the Celts is clear enough that's they refer to them over there, the Cornish, the Welsh, as foreigners. That's not them. That's it. That's how they are.
I always thought it was interesting that Alfred the Great, who of course was a big time Christian, I mean, as I said earlier, he went to Rome at least once, and I think he went twice actually. But he was an educated man. He could read Latin. He travelled, but he still claimed descent from Woden.
Yeah, I mean, people like let's see, Anglo-Saxons, nobility and kings at this time would have been radically different to the Anglo-Saxons we were talking about on this stream, definitely. But yeah, he was still connected to that pagan root. He still refers to himself, as you said, there's the heir, his bloodline. I mean, his family bloodline was descendant of royalty, and that royalty directly comes from the gods, from the Germanic gods.
Woden, of course, being the English version of Odin, basically.
Yeah, and that's a very sort of Indo-European sort of style. I mean, you see that in the Rome Etruscans, across many societies. That sort of connection between the chief gods.
Julius Caesar claimed descent from the gods. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, technically, I'm going to head off in a minute, but before I go, you could say the Jews, in pre-Christian times, or Jesus, I should say, the connection with the house of David, the sort of that sort of royal divine house. It's quite a common trope in across many different religions.
Adaman in the chat is saying that he's also a patron saint of the Russian Orthodox Church. I presume he means Alfred the Great. I'm not sure. Is that right? Is that right, Mitch?
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh,
Yeah,
2002, I think it was.
yeah. I was going to say, yeah, before the schism in the 11th century, yeah, he would have been.
someone's asking if we think Ragnar Lothbrok existed. I have no idea myself. I don't know what you guys think.
I think he did. Yeah, I think he
I'd
did.
imagine so.
I think he did. I think by that time, I mean, you're not really in the dark ages of like your Hengist and Horsa's 6th century period. At this time, the fact that they are recorded, I think so. I mean, his sons, isn't it the fact that his sons, they were real. So it's kind of like
Yeah.
I
There's usually some truth behind these uh, semi legendary figures. I mean, look, Romulus and Remus is a good case in point for Rome, but there is usually some truth to these things. Richard Phillips says, "I don't know. I thought you had to be dead to be a patron saint, but I'm no expert." Pretty sure Alfred the Great's been dead for quite a while, actually. But anyway.
Yeah, I know.
yeah.
I know. Like Sweden, for example, one of their first ruling dynasty was from Bjorn Ironside, and he was a son of Ragnar Lothbrok, and you also got the Danish Sigurd Snake in the Eye, who was also a son of Ragnar. So you got Sweden and Denmark who claim, that they're starting it royal families originate from Ragnar Lothbrok. I mean, it's like, it's the same with and it's not the same with Harald Fairhair of Norway, who, they say that he united Norway because a woman told him she did not consider him important, and she said, okay, she'd marry him only if he conquered all of Norway in her name. And he's also called Fairhair because apparently he refused to have his hair cut until he did his job of unifying Norway, which he did in like 15 years or something. So a lot of it probably might just be a bit of embellishment, but there's got to be a kernel of truth to it because I mean,
Yeah, it's like in Beowulf. There is characters in Beowulf who were probably real because they're recorded on like engaging in raids along the Rhine against the Franks, for example. So even within something like Beowulf, there are figures who are real.
yeah.
I mean,
So
there's usually some seed of truth in most of these legendary figures. I mean, to bring us back to what we're talking about here, King Arthur. I mean, there are various theories about King Arthur that he could have been some sort of Roman auxiliary or all sorts of things. And AI had a very good example that it could be possibly a part of the root of that legend earlier.
I mean, one of the problems that we have is just that there's very little. I mean, you have Gildas, for example, but effectively his Gildas, his writing was just a complaint letter to the ruling Roman British, well, the remaining Roman British governance that like the land's in chaos. You got the Saxons and the Germanic people flooding in, and this is a total disaster. And so it's not, you know, I mean, when it comes down to it, it's very one-sided. And
the written records are so sparse, as you say.
Well, yeah. I mean, even Bede, who I really like, even Bede, like he refers. There's one bit in this like a really weird bit where he sort of refers that the Shetland Islands were part of the Roman Empire, which it's not true. We know it's not
No.
true. So even with Bede, what he puts in there isn't entirely accurate as well. Which is, I mean, there's some things in there which he is spot on because it corresponds with, particularly like early Roman history that he gets in there is accurate. But you do have like odd points where it's like, all the Shetlands were part of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, I mean, the closest they came to that, we do know that a Roman fleet sailed all the way around the top of Scotland, which proved that Britain was an island, which up until that time they didn't actually know. but we know that a Roman fleet did actually sail all around the top of Scotland, and that was probably the closest the Romans came to being in the Shetland Islands, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, on land, the closest they ever got, I think, north was probably around the Murray Firth region.
Yeah,
Up
they
in
went
north.
much further north than people think they did, and they were fighting battles around there. Was it Tacitus's relative? His
Yeah,
father-in-law. His father-in-law, I think.
Yeah,
that's when you
Agricola.
go into the story of the Lost Legion, the legion that just vanished, which no one knows what happened with them up in against the Picts. Most likely may have been massacred. I mean, who knows? But
It was simply that they disappeared from the Roman records that we have, but the Roman records that we have are pretty patchy, shall we say?
yeah,
I mean, you know,
I'm gonna head. I, I'm g-
thanks for
I'm gonna
coming
try.
on, AI.
I'll
Before
head
you
off now.
go, would you like to plug your channel?
Yeah, AI. Well, I've got the name of my channel now. Shire Homelander or something like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
AI Shire Homelander.
If you
Yeah.
if you put in AI Shire Tory, it still comes up.
Yeah, it still comes up anyway. No, thanks for having me on, and I'll probably have a bit more. I'm looking forward to next week. We'll talk about the Heptarchy, and people in chat like Duke Valentino we'll get onto like the Christianization and how these the nation these kingdoms formed, um,
And the Viking invasions and all that.
and the
We'll talk
Viking
about all
invasion.
that next week. Is going to be all that stuff. And
Yeah,
I might even have a little bit more to say because I actually know a little bit about Wessex and King Alfred, but I don't know
that's good.
anything about what we're
Well, hopefully
talking
you're
about.
better by then. And also, just to ask about the King Arthur, the Arthur film. It had good bits in it, but one of the problems I had is that it was viewed as like the Germanics, the Saxons coming down from the north, and as we talked about, the Saxons were arrived in the south. It was the Angles in the north. In many ways, it shouldn't have been like them retreating from north to south. It should have gone from east to west, if it was to
Yeah,
be more historically accurate. And I think if they, I mean, again, the Roman uniforms in that are terrible. In some ways, you have the old stupid leather biker, action there, and out of
they
date
do that
Roman
everything nowadays.
everything. But if
Even
they actually,
that new movie they're making about the Odyssey. Is it the Odyssey or yeah? I think it's the Odyssey. That Nolan's making. The costumes that we've seen so far are really awful and nothing like what they would have actually been wearing.
Yeah, plus the ancient Greek ship and also a pretty Viking longship.
Yep, exactly. Yes, indeed. Rather than some sort of trireme, which it probably would have been, but you know.
yeah. Yeah, it's yeah. There's also like a Battle of Hastings BBC series coming up that I've seen. Again, they've got the chain. I mean, at least they got the
How
chainmail,
many
but then they
black
have.
people are going to be in the Anglo-Saxon army?
Yeah, that's what I'm waiting for. It's really funny because they haven't released all the cast. They haven't released all the casting, so I guess like figures like his half brother, sort of Bishop Odo and stuff like that. I'm guessing are going to be black or brown.
Yeah, no. I mean, there's no way they're going to have an all-black army. There's just not,
No,
you know.
no, not
It's
going to
like the
happen.
BBC. It's the biased brainwashing
Yeah,
corporation. So, you know.
yeah. Anyway, thanks for having me on, guys, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining, and I will put your channel in the description. Any final stuff you want to talk about, Mitch?
No, I think that if but I've got some stuff going on my head, but that's more later stuff to do with like King Alfred and because
Well, we'll talk. We'll definitely talk about King Alfred and Wessex and what have you next week, which I hope you'll be able to join us for. Because, like, for people in the chat, like Mitch can read Old English and stuff like that, which I certainly can't. So Mitch knows a lot more about this stuff than I do, and in some respects, so does AI. Also, I've been sick, so I haven't had a great deal to say on this stream. I hope you'll join us next week, Mitch, for the second episode of this series.
Just to answer, I'll be on for next week. Yeah,
Good,
I should.
good.
Yeah. Do I think Last Kingdom is better than Vikings? The first few seasons of Last Kingdom, yeah, I would say it's better than Vikings. Vikings, like the first few seasons, I liked of Vikings in terms of some of the accent. I like the main character and whatnot, but
Yeah.
the costumes are crap. I
Yeah,
can't take it.
they look like biker gangs, or as Atman said, something out of a BDSM club. It's,
And the other thing is that massive loads of shield maidens, which sorry, that's just not a common thing. Like you imagine, if you could imagine, say, one woman, and even then she'd have to disguise herself as a man for such a scenario. Because do you imagine, like, it's like women and children policy with the HMS Birkenhead, like men would do all manner of stuff to save a woman. You don't want to have a woman on a battlefield at all.
especially when all the weapons are muscle powered, and you have to kill the enemy at sword point or spear point or axe point. Women ain't too good at that stuff. I'm sorry, they're just not.
So the average height of a woman back then was like 5 foot. Do you trust a 5 foot woman to keep her share of a shield wall?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the shield maidens were a Norse mythology thing. They were a myth. They were a myth. They weren't something that you saw every day in real life.
So they were talking. The black female leader. The thing was the original. So the black woman was playing a guy called was playing a Viking man by the name of Jarl Hakon Sigurdsson, who, yeah, he's mainly known for because this was at the time when Norway, they were kind of vacillating between paganism and Christianity. So Jarl Sigurdsson, which I only knew of this guy really because of Survivor Joy. Yeah. The guy was described as being quite tall man. Well, not a black woman at all.
Yeah, no, that's the thing about The Last Kingdom. It's the Last Kingdom. As Mitch said, the first 2 or 3 seasons are pretty good, but then it goes madly feminist and starts putting female warriors all over the place. And I actually stopped watching it, I think, in the 4th season, just because I just couldn't take the girl bosses anymore. Although I will say they made a movie right at the end of The Last Kingdom called 7 Kings Must Die, I think. And that is actually not bad. And it's got a quite well-filmed battle scene in it where there's actually formations rather than people just randomly hacking at each other everywhere. Which they didn't do.
Because you've got a factor that Anglo-Saxons and Vikings had very similar fashions and very similar sets of armor. So you imagine you can't just be a massive mosh pit because otherwise everyone would just be friendly killing each other. Friendly.
Well, yeah, I mean, in The Last Kingdom, they give the Anglo-Saxons these kind of almost Roman-looking square shields. But of course, the Anglo-Saxons didn't use those. The Anglo-Saxons, in reality, used round shields just like the Vikings. As Mitch said, they were the fashions and all the rest of it was very similar. The armor was very similar. The weapons were very similar. They fought in formations. People always fight in formations if they can, but Hollywood just will not accept this for the most part.
Yeah, so someone's asking about Septimius Severus. Now, Septimius Severus, he's often put in as a sub-Saharan African historically. No, he wasn't. He was of Semitic blood. And what's more, when he was visiting a Roman garrison in York, I believe, he came across an Ethiopian soldier. He considered that such a bad omen that he ordered that black soldier deported back to Ethiopia.
Yeah, he is sometimes. People try and claim he was black. He wasn't black any more, by the way, than who was it we were talking about earlier in the stream? Which the Hannibal. Hannibal wasn't black either. he was also from North Africa, and at a time when North Africa had not been conquered by the Arabs, and so the North African people were not even as dark as they are today.
Yeah, it's worth noting with Carthage, let's say Carthage, where their language is related to Hebrew, and apparently, if you were to get like a text of Carthaginian and played before, let's say someone in Israel, apparently Israelis can read it fairly well, right? Once you factor of course different scripts, but the
Yeah.
words aren't that different. And I'm sort of thinking so, and not now. I don't know about an average modern day journalist, but if I look at an Israeli, they don't look sub-Saharan to me. Like
No.
they look they basically look the same as Lebanese or Jordanian, like Syrian, Levantine.
Someone asked
So,
about Cleopatra in the chat, and Cleopatra was a Macedonian, i.e., a Greek. She
yeah, it's
was
worth noting
a
that.
Macedonian Greek, so she was
Yeah,
not black. I'm sorry.
yeah, yeah, it's worth noting. So, Ptolemy, who founded the Egyptian dynasty, um, he disagreed with Alexander the Great's policy of mixed marriages with different peoples of the empire. So the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt back then, they refused to intermix with the locals. So
Well,
Cleopatra,
they even used to do brother-sister marriages, so they certainly didn't mix with the locals.
no. So Cleopatra would look like the average Greek woman in Thessalonica in northern Greece. That's what she looked
Yeah,
like.
yeah, absolutely
She would
right.
not, like, she wouldn't look at all African or Egyptian. Even she'd look, perhaps she'd be a bit. And also, you got the fact that Greek women are depicted as paler than the men because, of course, women stay indoors, whereas the men
Yeah.
do the work outside. So,
This is part of the reason why people say that Timius Severus was black, is because on one of his surviving portraits, he is shown as much darker than his empress. But that was a convention in the ancient world. Men were always shown as darker than women because, as Mitch says, men were supposed to be outside, going to war and all this kind of stuff, whereas women tended to try and stay inside and out of the sun.
yeah, that's one thing. That was a beauty standard for ancient Crete and ancient Mycenae, if I'm pronouncing that right. That
Yeah.
women were paler because it's considered that more a beauty trait.
And of course, when we say women, we're really talking mostly about upper class women because, poorer women probably still had to go and work in the fields. But upper class women would, just like in relatively modern days, women would try and stay out of the sun and keep their complexion if they could afford to do so.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's absolutely true. But yeah, I mean, anything they make these days, I always shudder when they're going to make something historical these days because they're almost invariably going to put women in positions of power they shouldn't be in, or black people where there were no black people. They just do that all the time.
Oh yeah, it's like the Last Kingdom did that with Lady Athelflaed of Mercia. Now, Athelflaed of Mercia, she was a figurehead. She wasn't a general or
No,
a font. She was like
absolutely not. Yeah.
she'd be let's say the closest thing she'll be to a frontline soldier would be giving speeches to the troops, telling them to fight on for England and so on against the Vikings. She would be nowhere near the actual fighting, or like
Well, why would they risk? They wouldn't have risked of being killed or captured. They just wouldn't. I'm sorry. Severus was campaigning in Britain, up in Scotland. He was he was conquering more of Britain, is what Timius Severus was doing in Britain.
Oh, I thought he was just in like a royal tour or imperial tour.
No, he actually launched an invasion of Scotland.
Yeah, it's
the Romans invaded Scotland several times, and as we were saying earlier in the stream, they went much further north in Scotland than many people realise. I mean, Hadrian's Wall, for example, was at one stage abandoned, and the Romans built the Antonine Wall, which is in the middle of Scotland. You can see it if you're on the train going from Glasgow to Edinburgh. You can see it in places.
What happened to the Picts? There was similarity by the Gaelic tribes of. So Scotland is named after the Scoti, because Scoti were a Gaelic tribe coming in from Ulster. And the thing is, the word Scot means brute or barbarian in Latin. So in a way, if you were to name, let's say, for example, you come across a man named Scott, yeah, I suppose you can literally say to him, you might like, it literally means like brute or churl in. So yeah, that's what happened to the Pictish was they were like, so this is why so you have this is why the Highlanders they speak English nowadays, but back in the day they used to speak Gaelic because Gaelic replaced Pictish. The main reason why that happened was because the Vikings kept raiding Dalriata, which is like this western kingdom along the Hebrides. So the Gaelic tribes had to move inland to avoid the Vikings, but that meant screwing over the Pictish, and by that time the Pictish were gone. Uh, One thing about the Pictish was so the Pict comes from the word picture, literally mean because the Pictish would the main distinguishing thing about it was the tattoos they had. So literally, so Pictish literally means the painted ones.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I've watched movies where they've shown the Picts, and that's full of female warriors, and I'm pretty sure the Picts didn't have many female warriors, to be honest, in reality.
I know I saw one quote about apparently how Romans didn't like Celtic women. I think that's what a lot of feminism. So apparently, there's one quote that circulates here and there, where it's basically saying, "Oh, well, apparently Celtic women are as strong as the average Roman legionary." And I go,
Yeah, don't think so.
well, well, it's like, for example, who do you reckon would be stronger, like a 5'7" Italian bloke or a 5'3" Scottish bird from Glasgow?
Yeah, and
My
especially
money
an Italian bloke who's been military training for the past 10 years, and carrying around 100 pounds of equipment all the time.
Yeah, the other thing is, it's like people, or this is one thing I just talk about how they just so you always show the Romans as like going into their formation and fighting one on one with barbarians. They go, the thing was, so the Celts and the Germanics were generally taller and had bigger frames than the average Roman legionary. This is why discipline was such a big thing among the
Yeah.
Romans.
Yeah.
So yeah, so what they would do is have a gladius, while say a Celtic or Germanic tribesman is bashing away with his axe against a Roman shield. The Roman would stab the barbarian just below the armpit, where it would pierce the lung, and that's the guy down.
Yeah, yeah, and of course the Roman legionaries had much better armor than most of the people they were fighting. The average Roman legionary had the sort of armor which, if you were a Celt or a Pict or whatever, only the chieftains could afford.
Yeah, because most Celtic warriors, especially the Gauls that fought in the Vercingetorix, they would have only had they'd be wearing like a shirt, pair of trousers. I don't think they could afford like really good shoes. I can't think.
They might, if they'd have been lucky, they might have had a helmet, but that would have been it. A helmet and a shield was their protection, basically. And not all of them would have even had helmets.
I thought it was just like a leather cap or something. I thought it was something like that leather cap.
Quite a few Gauls had helmets because the Roman helmet was copied from the Gauls. The Romans were very good at copying weapons, like the gladius sword was copied from the Spanish. The helmet that everyone associates with Roman legionaries that they generally use in Hollywood films, that's a Gallic helmet, because the Gauls used to use it. But the guys who could afford that would really have been the chieftains and maybe some of their household troops, the guys who were kept just about total for war.
Yeah, and it's, I always thought with Scotland, I thought it was a matter of the Romans never conquered the place because it was just logistically getting tough for them to deal with Britannia from shores of say Sussex all the way up to where Hadrian's Wall is. I thought they just can conquer Scotland because it was too much of a burden on their logistics. I mean, it's like, yeah, Britannia, like, yeah, some people have heard on me to go, oh, well, the Romans eagerly abandoned us because they were, because it was a cost to them. And I go, well, no, it was because of a tin in Cornwall, among other stuff in Britannia that the Romans took a life towards. As for Scotland, perhaps they could have found something, but I just thought it was a logistical burden that they never
Yeah,
bothered
I
to
mean, it's like, as we were saying on this stream, Mitch, that the part of the reason the Anglo-Saxons didn't conquer Wales and didn't conquer Cornwall and parts of Devon is because the land was poor. If you look at farming, even today in say Cornwall and Devon and Wales and Scotland, a lot of it is sheep farms, because sheep are the only damn thing you can really raise there, because the land's not very good and the climate's not all that great in the north of Scotland either.
Yeah, it's like G-Vance is asking how effective would a Roman soldier be one-on-one with a tribal warrior? Not really that good. That was why Romans had to be so disciplined. But also, that's one reason I like Rome, because I can't remember which episode it was, but they show like a battle where Roman officer blows a whistle and they rotate between the front line and the rear line, because that's what the Romans used to do to avoid exhaustion on the part of their troops. That's what the
Yeah,
Romans used to
they used their discipline and training, and as I say, they were also better equipped than the people they were fighting. An ordinary Roman legionary had better armor, at least as good as a Celtic or a Gaulish chieftain would have had.
Yeah, and the other thing was, that's basically what propelled Rome. Because another thing about Rome was, because I was looking at the Second Punic War, and it's like one thing you get about the Romans is, one of the main reasons why they win so much is because they never give up. Because Second Punic War, where battles like Trasimene and Lake Cannae, they lose absolute crap loads of men, but they don't give up because the Romans generally hold on to the view of, well, look, if we lose everything. Whereas the Carthaginians, all they had to do was just weigh down the Carthaginian war effort, because of course Hannibal didn't have unanimous support back home. You had Hanno of the other faction who was just chipping away at Hannibal's ability to sustain the war effort, and that's why Rome eventually won, because they had far more logistical, they had far more willpower and far more.
They had a bigger population. They had a bigger population. I mean, the Carthaginians made a great deal of use of mercenaries, for example. Like most of the Carthaginian army wasn't Carthaginian. It was mercenaries of one description or another.
Yeah, it's like you often had like Trasimene, for example. One of the main reasons why the battle was so effective was because Hannibal used a lot of Gallic warriors, and the Roman general Flaminius was hated by the Celts because he was trying to settle loads of Latin-speaking people onto northern Italy, and that's why the Celts were so eager to follow the plan. Whereas usually we're not very good at following.
Their discipline was not their strongest point usually.
Yeah, but when Hannibal told them, okay, if you do what I say, I will give you the prize of killing off the enemy general, of course, Flaminius. The Celts, apparently there was like 100 Celtic warriors in that battle who got killed because they all tried to speed one towards Flaminius. That was kind of like, that's the main reason why the Celts and the Germanics lost generally in battles to the Romans, because the Romans had discipline and more willpower, whereas this is one thing about the Anglo-Saxons, they're very little more individualistic. So this is why you'd often have. So this is why you'd have to, let's say, one ruler. Once he dies, everything falls apart after that ruler dies. Whereas ancient Rome, you had a bureaucracy, you had institutions and technology and whatnot. That meant that if one ruler died, there'd be succession. That would be the civil war, but things would tick up all right, so that things stayed up.
But next week, when we talk about the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, people will be able to see that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms by the time of Alfred the Great, certainly, were actually starting to develop bureaucracies and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, Mitch?
Yeah, because the thing was, to be fair, this happens all over Europe. Where let's say you have a pagan population, yeah, might have a kingdom or an empire, but it's based upon tributes, like the Kievan Rus or Carolingian Empire or Visigoths in Iberia or Lombards and so on. But they convert to Christianity and then they learn. Because I think Julius Everly, he calls the Dark Ages period the Germanic Latin synthesis, because you have Germanic tribes, they come in and they learn off the example of ancient Rome, how to have a bureaucracy, how to have institutions, how to have something resembling an actual civilization. So Anglo-Saxons, yeah, we learn off Charlemagne's example, for example. Like, and so on.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Alfred the Great used to write to the Charlemagnic Emperor.
Yeah, King Otho of Mercia, he was best friends with Charlemagne. Charlemagne only referred to one man ever as his equal, about King Otho of Mercia.
Interesting. Well, guys, like I said, next Wednesday we'll have part 2 of this stream, and we'll look at the rather better known part of the Anglo-Saxon story, which is the Norse invasions and all that kind of stuff. So we'll be back with that at 9:30, but that will be on Wednesday. And I also want to give people a heads up that on Thursday, Friday next week, I haven't quite set the time yet, I'm going to be doing an Anzac Day stream. That's going to be later than this, because I'm going to try and organize it more for Australian viewers, obviously, because it's Anzac Day. But I've got one guest coming on from the Australian Patriotic League, and I'm trying to get someone from the British Australian community as well. And I'll ask Tim Wilms if he wants to come on as well. So yeah, I'll be doing an Anzac Day stream on Thursday, Friday, time to be arranged. And of course, we'll be back on Sunday with our normal current affairs and politics stream, 9:30 on Saturday evening, British time. So do come and watch those. Let me have a quick check to make sure we don't have any super chats.
Oh, just so not next week, but the week after, are you doing that Anglo-German naval arms race? Because I'll come on for that.
Yes, I might, Mitch. Yeah, I might do that. I do want to do that stream because I think it will be quite interesting for people. So this is the Anglo-German from 1900 to 1914. Sorry, Mitch, carry on.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, all I would say is, I'll probably need let's say for August, like a day, just to, because there's an article I shared in the Discord about it from that big search fella, but I'm not really good.
That was really good, Mitch. Yeah, I think that would be an interesting subject, and I'd certainly like you to come on for that. So yeah.
Yeah.
Someone's saying, would a gladiator who was a Roman soldier lose against a Gallic warrior? Why would a gladiator be a Roman soldier? I don't understand.
I mean, didn't Roman soldiers generally get a generous pension or something?
Yes, they did. After 25 years, they usually got a cash settlement, and also very often they also got
they also got citizenship. Citizenship, and so one thing I look at about ancient Romans. So, for example, there's that famous he was a consul of Rome moment from the Rome series. So Julius Caesar said that because the thing was, the Roman attitude was, you could be a scoundrel, you could be a criminal, you could be whatever, but if you were born a Roman, no one could touch your hair on your head other than other Romans. So if the Egyptians killed
and you had to be a Roman citizen to be a Roman soldier. The guys who got citizenship were the auxiliaries. If you joined the auxiliaries at the end of your 25 years, you were given Roman citizenship.
I can't remember which Roman emperor was it that scrapped that citizenship rule. I can't remember what it was.
Caracalla made everyone a Roman citizen, but he mainly did it so he could charge more tax, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something that the army was saying, no, don't do that, because that was a good incentive for auxiliaries to be signing up, because, well,
Absolutely
these are
true.
good.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
after that, it killed off the desire among, let's say, non-Latin speaking subjects of the empire to actually bother signing up. So they had to increase more and more in Germanic mercenaries. Well, look how well that went for Vortigern dealing with Hitler's daughter, because it's like Hadrian's Wall. They reckon that one of the main reasons why the Anglo-Saxon invasion happened was because so the mercenaries that manned Hadrian's Wall were Germanic, and they probably were telling their folks back home, okay, look, this land is weak. It's full of people who can't lift a sword, coming over and just take over the place. Because of course, mercenaries, you can't trust them to be loyal. It's like Machiavelli was saying in his book.
Certainly, if you can't pay them, you can't. That's for sure.
Yeah. So.
But yeah, no. I think next week's show will be interesting. So do come and join us there, but also come and watch our stream on Saturday. We'll be here. Hopefully, Mitch will be a guest. He usually is. And we'll be talking about current events, the news, and politics with a British and Old Commonwealth bias. I think we're pretty much the only stream these days that looks at stuff mostly from a British and Old Commonwealth point of view, rather than from across the Atlantic. So yeah, come and check that out. Mitch, anything you wanted to plug, mate?
Nah, not for me.
All right. Well, I'm gonna play us out of a tune then, if I can. There we go. See how long this takes to go up. There we go.
Once more for Greenland we are bound. All behind our bullocks the icy wind. We left our sweethearts and our wives weeping on the pier. Cheer up, me dears, we soon shall return, for it's only half a year. With tarry dress we reached Stromness, where we did go ashore, with whalemen scarce and the water even less. We had to take on more. And when we come to the northern ice, we crowded on full sail, each boat well manned with a keen and lively band, all for to hunt the whale. Now dark and dreary grows the night, and the stars begin to burn, with the chasing of the whale and the trying of the oil, and it seems like we'll never return. Our 6 months being done, we tie up again, and the lads all go ashore with plenty of brass and a bonny, bonny lad. To Greenland's frost we'll drink a toast, and to them we love so dear, and across the icy main to the whaling grounds again we'll take a trip next year.
And that was a British whaling song from the 19th century. And it's from Patriotic Archive, who has an excellent channel if you're into military, naval, or folk music, particularly from Britain, but he's got some from other parts of the world as well. So go and check out Patriotic Archive. Thanks for joining us. Thank you very much to my guests, Mitch and AI. And I'll see you guys on Saturday. Go well, people.